Okay, clock just ticked over to 9 o'clock, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the first session of the 2020 Part 2 Vermont Maple Conferences. My name is Mark Isselhart. I'm the Maple Specialist with the University of Vermont Extension, and Allison Hope, Executive Director from BMSMA, is also here. Just wanted to say a quick couple of things about our session and then get right to it. A few things. One, obviously we're online, we're not in person, so you can probably find your own way to the bathrooms at this point. If your coffee doesn't taste very good, that's not us, sorry. And we, on the more serious side, if you are looking for help with captioning, we do have a link in the chat box for live captioning, so please take advantage of that if that is helpful to you. If there are problems with AV or any sort of technical issues, feel free to reach out in that chat function as well. We can try to remedy those on our end. The questions and answer will happen at the end of the session. We have a lot of slides. Abby has a lot of slides to get through, and so we're going to not take questions during the presentation, unless there's something really obvious that needs to get corrected. But in terms of the content, we're not going to do question and answer until the end. Please stay muted throughout the whole presentation until we get to that question and answer. It'll really help everyone's experience be better. Reminder that there are 14 sessions remaining beyond this one, so please check out the rest of the week, all the way through Friday at 5 p.m. If you're here and you're interested in getting forester credits, if you're a licensed forester and looking for that certificate, please email me directly, and I'll put my email in the chat, and we can get you that certificate right away. And in general, just thank you for participating. This is an unprecedented time for all of us, and we're really excited to have a robust presentation today and a whole program of great content. So we're really excited about that. So please stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you in person next year. So I do want to do just a brief introduction of Abby Vandenberg. Dr. Abby Vandenberg is a research associate professor and assistant director at the UVM Proctor Maple Research Center. Can't possibly go through all her accomplishments and credentials at this point, but just know that her work focuses on so many aspects of maple production, everything from tree health all the way through to making the highest quality product possible. And we're really excited to have her. The most recent accolade that Abby has achieved was the 2020 recipient of the Sugar Makers Association Sumner Williams Lifetime Achievement Award. So we're really excited to have her, and without further ado, please welcome Abby Vandenberg.
Thank you, Mark. As always, a very kind introduction. So let me get my presentation up here and we'll get rolling. All right, so welcome everyone. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here with you, and I'm super excited to do this and to be a part of these first virtual conferences. So today's presentation is going to be all about early tapping and various taphole longevity strategies. So, and as Mark mentioned, it's a big project. So I have a lot to get through, and I might hurry through some of it just to make sure that we get to everything. That's a lot to fit into an hour presentation. So anyway, so why would we tap early or think about these freshening strategies? And when I'm talking about freshening, that's kind of a euphemism for revisiting a taphole to either ream it wider, drill it deeper, to basically access potentially new vessels to get more sap. So some of the basic reasons of why we might consider doing this, and first and foremost, is to potentially take advantage of early sap flow. So we know and have always known that once the trees enter the dormant season, anytime that we have above and below freezing temperature fluctuations, there will be some amount of pressure that allows sap to flow, whether that's in the fall or during thaws in December and January. So some of the thinking about, let's try to tap earlier is to increase overall yield simply by taking advantage of those earlier sap flows. But sort of more serious, I don't want to say more serious, but some other motivations for tapping earlier is to potentially mitigate some of the impacts that we've been seeing of the changing climate around us. And one of those effects that we see is a trend for the season to end, the traditional maple production season to end earlier and earlier. And we see this exhibited, or evidence of this, in a number of different ways. What I have here is a graph of the day of the year that bud break occurs at, or has occurred at, the Proctor Maple Research Center since 1990. And you can see here that it fluctuates quite a bit from year to year, of course, but that the overall trend is for bud break to happen earlier and earlier. And this isn't just happening at the Proctor Center, this is happening everywhere. So this is just one piece of evidence that we have that shows us that the maple production season is ending earlier and earlier. And so tapping earlier is potentially a way to mitigate against this. And then another reason we might consider tapping earlier is simply to mitigate some risks of an unusual or poor standard sap flow season. And again, one of the sort of the best indicators or examples of a poor standard sap flow season, particularly as it relates to climate change, is 2012. I'm sure most people in this virtual room right now remember 2012. We had 3 days of 70-degree temperatures in the heart of the maple production season that basically shut everything down. The season ended very early. There were terrible yields for most people that year. So tapping early is potentially a way to mitigate or offset the risks of something like that happening. And then the final thing that we put up here is that, for large operations, say you've got 80,000 or 120,000 taps, tapping early is really a practical necessity to be able to get all of the taps in time for the primary production season, in time for that to start. Tapping early is a way to, simply a necessity to make that happen. So for all of these reasons, it is of interest to us to see what we actually get in terms of yields and effects of some of these early tapping strategies. And I have to say, it's one of our most favorite things to say at the Proctor Center when it comes to maple research in particular. There is nothing new under the sun. So people in maple research have been looking at the yields and effects of early tapping since the 1960s with our colleague Mel Kelling at Michigan State. And as recently as 2008, Senator Acer did a study looking at the yields from autumn tapping. And so we basically, actually the short version of the results of all of these studies is that none of them found any increased yields from tapping in the fall. However, even the study that was done in 2008, the technology, even though it's relatively recent, the technology that's advanced, particularly with respect to the levels of vacuum we're able to achieve, as well as the sanitation strategies that we are using and employing now, these advances have made it potentially made early tapping strategies possibly be more effective than they were even just a decade ago. So it was certainly worth taking another look. So there are sort of two categories of questions that we want to answer with respect to these early tapping and taphole longevity strategies. And the first big category, of course, are questions of yields and economics. So we actually need to find out if we're tapping early, whether it's in the fall, in the early winter, and with or without any of these reaming or longevity strategies, are we actually getting more sap than when we put in a standard taphole? Or does it simply feel like there's more sap because we go and freshen a hole and we get a little bit more sap for a couple of days? So it's really important to do a controlled study of that to see whether there actually are greater sap yields from any of these various strategies. And then there's other questions related to yield and things like, are we actually getting less sap because of the earlier response to the taphole drying and earlier wound response? And the overall question of economics is, even if we're getting more sap than standard tapping, is it actually enough to increase the offset costs? And those offset costs are not just, of course, having to revisit the tapholes twice and different supplies, but also the effects of additional non-conductive wood, particularly from these from the freshening and reaming strategies. And so that brings up the second set of questions, which are questions related to sustainability. So we know, particularly with the reaming and freshening strategies, longevity strategies, that we are going to get more non-conductive wood. If we're making a bigger hole, the size of non-conductive wood that we make from a taphole is proportional to the size of the hole that we make. So we know that most of these strategies are going to give us more non-conductive wood to begin with. But there are also other questions about, are we actually getting more non-conductive wood than we otherwise would have from a hole of that size because we're revisiting the same hole twice? So that's kind of a more nuanced question, but still a very important one. And then some other questions related to, like, is this actually good for the tree, for the forest, are things like having a longer time for that wound to be open, so all the way from October potentially to April, May. So is having a wound like that open longer, does it increase the risk of infection and subsequent decay for the tree? And then also, even more difficult to answer scientifically, but a really important question is that we're now not just taking potentially more of the tree's carbohydrate reserves, we're actually removing carbohydrates, the sugar reserves of the tree during a pretty critical time period for the tree when it actually needs those sugars, those resources. So just to touch on this for a moment, this figure shows, it's an oldie but goodie, this shows the concentration of sugar in the sap of a sugar maple tree or sugar maple trees over the entire course of the leafless period, so all the way from the end of October to May. And so we're already well familiar with this period right here. We know that the concentration of sugars in the sap gets pretty high as the tree begins to exit dormancy and prepare for new growth. And it's typically this that we are exploiting. But the concentration of sugars, there's sugars in the sap there the entire leafless period. And so on the one hand, it is this presence of sugars that we're attempting to utilize or exploit by tapping earlier, because there is sugar there to harvest, but it is there for a reason. So the sap and the sugar in the sap at this time is not just there, just kind of by happenstance. Those sugars are there to support the tree during the leafless period. So there are no leaves, like these awesome green leaves in my background here. There are no leaves there to photosynthesize, to provide fuel for the tree to live. So the carbohydrates that are present in the sap are there to support the respiration and all the functions of the tree that it needs to survive over the winter while it's not able to make its own fuel from harvesting sunlight. And they're also present there to help protect from freezing temperatures and a number of other different effects too. So sort of one of the bigger questions about taking or doing these early tapping strategies is taking sugar from the tree there at this point during the early dormant period, is it actually more impactful than taking it during the latter parts of the dormant period? So these are questions that are in our minds. But I'm kind of a simple person, and so I like to do things as simply as possible. And so for this particular study, we wanted to focus on the questions of yields and economic first, to determine if there really is any increased yield and overall net benefit of any of these early tapping strategies relative to standard spring tapping. We basically wanted to answer that question first to determine if there is any need to do any of the studies about sustainability, the more nuanced studies about sustainability. There's simply no reason to do those if these early tapping practices don't actually result in a net benefit or make any sense to do. So we chose to answer this question first. And I want to point out that this study was funded both by a grant from the North American Maple Syrup Council Research Fund, as well as one from the USDA ACER Access and Development Program. And I have to put in a big giant thank you for LaPierre. You'll see in a moment that there was quite a heavy need for the equipment costs for this study, and LaPierre was able to help us make that more feasible for us to afford, and this will all make sense in a moment. So this was the overall goal. Do any of these tapping practices actually result in a net benefit, increase yields relative to standard spring tapping, and also overall net benefit in terms of costs, and also in terms of the amount of non-conductive wood we're adding as a function of long-term yields and overall net benefit. So how we did this study, we basically had 7 different early tapping and freshening treatments plus a control, so 8 different treatments. Each of those treatments had 10 trees for each, so we had a total of 80 trees. The diameter of the trees in each treatment was equivalent to one another, so there was a range of sizes in each treatment group, but that was equally distributed across all the treatments. And so the average diameter, average size of the tree in each of those treatment groups was just under 13 inches. The entire, each tree was tubed separately into a separate 30-gallon sap collection chamber. So now you can get the idea. With 80 of these, that's a pretty hefty set of experimental infrastructure. And so each tree had its own chamber, and the vacuum of the system was maintained at very high levels over the course of the study. And so once the trees were tapped in with their respective treatment, we would then measure the volume of sap from each tree as well as its sugar content at several times, as many times as was necessary throughout the production season. And of course, the production season in this case sometimes went from October to April, so it's kind of a long time. So then at the end of the season, we can calculate the total yield for each tree and then the average total yield for each treatment. And then, of course, we also repeated this for 3 years, which is particularly important to do for a study like this. Early tapping in the fall, because of the differences in climate conditions from one fall or one winter to another, there can be very substantial differences in how good the yields are in fall or early winter from year to year. So it's really important to do this at minimum for 3 years. And so here are the treatments that we used. All of our treatments were relative to a standard spring taphole. So these tapholes were 5/16 inch diameter, 1.5 or 2 inches in subsequent years. And these are tapped at the standard date as the rest of the production operation at the Proctor Center, so basically mid-February. So then, in addition to that sort of control, we had 4 different fall tapping treatments. We had fall tapholes that were simply just a fall, same as a spring control, only they were tapped in as soon as so our fall tapping period had to be as soon as the leaves had dropped from the maple trees, as well as we actually had above and below freezing fluctuating temperatures. So, and as you'll see, that varies when that actually happens. That varies, the timing of that varies from year to year. But basically, these fall control holes were put in once those conditions were met and left alone until we pulled taps at the end of the spring. Then we had fall tapholes that were drilled at the standard size in the fall, and then on the same date as our spring tapholes, they were drilled deeper, so from 1.5 to 2.5 inches. We also had a fall Reaming deep treatment, so these were drilled as a 1/4 inch taphole in the fall, and then at the same date as our spring tapping, we then reamed them to 5/16 inch wide and then also deeper to 2.5 inches. Then we had this other, a little kind of an oddball 4th fall treatment where we put in a taphole, a 5/16 inch taphole, same as our spring control, but in the spring, we drilled a second hole of the same size, 2 inches immediately above that first hole, and then plug the first hole for vacuum to make sure that it didn't leak vacuum. And the idea of this was perhaps we could make a completely fresh taphole, so not just drilled a little bit deeper, but a fully fresh hole, but within the original column of non-conductive wood that would be developed by the first hole. So this is kind of an attempt to get more bang for your buck, get a completely fresh taphole, but by tapping within the column of non-conductive wood, perhaps make less overall non-conductive wood than another additional taphole. So, and we'll see later how that was just a terrible, terrible idea. Anyway, we also had 3 early winter treatments. So we're doing these in fall. So basically as soon as leaves drop and we have freezing and thawing temperatures. Our early winter treatments, those also varied in timing. The idea was to make sure that the fall tapping period was really over, but that we also had temperatures above freezing to actually collect some sap. So you'll see that this varies from year to year as well, the timing of that. But they were essentially the same treatments as our fall treatments, a control that was left alone, one that was reamed deeper or re-drilled deeper at the same date of spring tapping, and one that was a 1/4 inch spout initially and then reamed to 5/16 inch wide and 2.5 inches deep later. So this was year 1. Year 2, we had the same exact treatments, only we modified our control depth to 2 inches instead of 1.5. And then in year 3, again, we had the same treatments, except we ditched the fall second hole above the first hole for reasons which will become evident later. And so instead of those, we added a late season reaming treatment. So these were tapholes that were initially made on the same date as our spring controls. So in this year, February 12th. And then after we had experienced temperatures, 4 days of temperatures above 50 degrees, we then re-drilled those tapholes to 2.5 inches deep. So I have this table here to show kind of how those various dates, how the dates varied from one another from year to year. So our spring tapping varies a little bit, but that's very tied to the production operation, so it's a little bit more standard. But when fall and winter happened really depended on the conditions outside, which varied a lot. So we were tapping in fall after the second week in November initially, but then the next year we were in the 3rd week of October. And you can see also that the seasons ended at fairly different dates throughout the study. So we went all the way to April 23rd in the first year, and then last year everything stopped on April 8th. And I should note that the season end dates for all sap yield studies at the Proctor Center are, well, if the sap just simply stops flowing, then that's one thing. But generally speaking, this is the last sap collection before we get buddy or late season flavor syrup in our operations. So when we're talking about the sap that we collected from this, it is sap that made retail grade syrup. And I think that's important to point out. Okay. And so just some pictures of the infrastructure, which you've already seen. Imagine 80 of these. This is less than 1/3. It's hard to envision 80 of those, but they're there. And just some images that are kind of unusual about early tapping. So the leaves on the maple trees are gone at this point, but things like beech still have a lot of their leaves. So it can be like kind of a little bit of a brain messed up thing to be tapping at that time when you're seeing the rest of the woods like that. And another note about just how we did this study, and I bring it up not just to show that this was really a challenge to do, but actually to bring up some of the challenges of actually tapping in the fall and making syrup, so actually doing commercial maple production in the fall. And that is when you tap in the fall, or even in the early winter, things freeze, and it freezes hard for a long time. And so this is something to keep in mind as a very practical thing to need to work around if you are making syrup, tapping and making syrup in the fall. But from an experiment point of view, what this meant is that in order to be able to measure the volume of sap and its sugar content, we actually had to place an additional container within the outside vacuum chamber so that we could extract the full container and swap it out with an empty one, and bring those containers inside to allow them to thaw out so that we could actually weigh the volume of the syrup and measure the sugar content. So it was quite an endeavor to actually do, but again, more important to bring up because it has a lot of practical, that freezing, and it's not going to thaw again until, you know, February or March. That has a lot of implications, practical implications, if you're going to actually tap during the fall and make syrup. All right, I'm going to skip through these just as this is just the weather and how it changed. It would vary from year to year. So just to get to the meat of this and try to not go over time here today. So lots of setup to get us essentially one graph. These are the total yield. So the total yield in terms of syrup volume in US gallons for each of those 8 treatments. And this is the average for the 3 years. So this is, you know, not just 1 year, this is the 3 years. And so you can, just to set things up here, the 4 fall treatments are on the left. Here are the 3 winter treatments, and here's the spring control. And we're going to ignore the Reaming ignore the late season reaming until a little bit later on. So I put the graph up in terms of just straight syrup yields to highlight 2 things. One is that we had a pretty big, these are error bars that show the basic variation around the mean, so the variation of trees within that treatment group. And so these bars are fairly wide for each of the treatments, and that's not unexpected because of course we had trees of all different sizes within those within that treatment. So we expect them to vary quite a bit because we know that yields are very affected by tree size. And so the other reason that I put this up here is to show that we had, even though we see a variation in yield from one treatment to another, what we see is that we have pretty incredible yields in all of the treatments. So the lowest yield that we got from any of our treatments on average was 0.6 gallons of syrup per tree, which is great to begin with. And I'm going to return to that point later on at the end of the study. And then the final thing that I want to point out that's very important is that although I'm going to talk about patterns, and you know, we see that some of the bars here, some of the averages appear higher or lower than the others, statistically speaking, there were no significant differences in the yields from any of these treatments. So that's important to point out. So from a pure statistical standpoint, there are no differences in any of these treatments to talk about, but certainly we can talk about patterns relative to one another, and that's what I'm going to do today. So I personally think that it is actually easier to look at these data not as straight yields in volume of syrup per tap relative to one another, but actually as percentages. And because we're using the spring control, so the standard spring tapping date as the sort of control for all of these, if we set this to 100%, the yields from the spring control, the spring tapholes as 100%, then we can compare the yields of the other treatments relative to that treatment. So just doing that, if we start over looking at the fall treatments, if we look at those fall control tapholes where we just put the taphole in the fall and let it go throughout the rest of the season, we saw that on average over the 3 years of that study, those tapholes yielded between basically 80–85% of our standard spring tapholes. So in terms of getting better yields, tapping in the fall was not advantageous. So not only did we get about 20% less sap, we did that by having, you know, it just wasn't worthwhile. Then if we also look at 2 of the other fall treatments, first the fall tapholes that were 1/4 inch wide that were subsequently reamed to 5/16 inch and 2.5 inches deeper, but also the fall second hole where we put a separate tap hole in above the second one in the spring. We see that those yielded basically about the same as our standard spring tap hole. So we got about the same amount of sap for having to visit them twice, use 2 different spouts, and create more non-conductive wood. So those 2 treatments were definitely, the economics there is pretty simple to look at. That just doesn't make any sense whatsoever to do. However, the fall tapholes that we just put in the fall and re-drilled deeper later, we see that those were on average 16% higher yield than our standard spring tap hole. So that starts to get a little bit interesting. Then if we look at our early winter treatments, early winter treatments, sorry, there's Chuck Bolton, if you could mute yourself, that would be great. I keep hearing you. You're popping up on my screen. Sorry, let me call you out. Anyway, so if we look at the winter treatments, the winter tap holes that we put in and just put in early winter and let them go, we see that those yielded on average 92% of our spring tap holes. So on the one hand, this shows, okay, there's no advantage of putting in those tap holes in the early winter, but it also, because it was between 10 and 8% less, what it kind of can indicate is that if we have to put those tap holes in the early winter, just from a practical standpoint to get our tap holes in, if we have a very large operation, that the cost in terms of lost sap yield isn't super significant. So it's not super advantageous to do it from a sap yield standpoint, but also not going to be a heavy loss if it's necessary to do that. But then we get to take a look at the winter freshened treatments, the winter tap holes that were 1/4 inch and then reamed wider and deeper later, and also the deeper, just re-drilled deeper later. Those yielded about 20% more than our standard spring controls. So that starts to get potentially a little interesting. One thing that we need to point out, though, is the tap hole depths for each of these various treatments. So remember that at least for the second 2 years, that the tap holes, our control holes, were all 2 inches deep. And in the first year, they were 1.5 inches deep. All of the freshened tap holes, the tap holes that used a longevity strategy, ultimately were 2.5 inches deep. And so the question, because we did not have a spring control tap hole that was 2.5 inches deep, what we can't say precisely in this study is how much of the yield, the gain in yield that we've gotten from these freshened tap holes, how much is from the extra sap that we collected by tapping early, and how much is because it was a slightly deeper tap hole than our control. And unfortunately, we aren't able to tease that out in this study. In all likelihood, it's probably a combination of both. Our other study that we've done on tap hole depth shows us that we generally don't get much more sap from a 2.5 inch tap hole relative to a 2 inch tap hole. But without having looked at that in this study, we really can't say how much is from the tap hole depth and how much is from the early yields. And I'm going to skip over this and this. This figure, I just wanted to show very quickly, this shows the percentage of the total yield that we got from each of those treatments that we got in each of the periods, the fall, winter, and spring. So what this generally shows is that for all of our treatments, of course, we're getting most of the total yield from those treatments in the spring tapping period. But the other kind of interesting thing is just that it shows how little extra sap gets collected in that winter period. So right around 10% of the total yield for any of the trees that were tapped at that time came during that winter period. So not a lot of sap flows even in all the 3 seasons that we did this, but 10% is 10%, and that does contribute to the overall yield. Okay, so let's take a quick look, before we look at some of the sustainability questions, let's take a quick look at that late season reaming treatment. So we only did this for 1 year. And so just looking, this is just the spring control trees and the ream late season trees, the overall means for the year that we did it. And when I looked at these data, I was really impressed because we reamed those, or re-drilled them to deeper, on March 30th. And our season ended only 9 days later. And lo and behold, we looked at this and we got 18% more sap in a very few number of sap flow days after that. So I was wowed. I got really excited about this. But because we were measuring the sap yields from all those chambers along the season, we were actually able to go back and look at, well, how much of the sap yield came before we reamed them and how much came after. And that was pretty revealing. So what we see here is the syrup yield of the spring control trees and the trees that we reamed in that late season reaming before we reamed them and after we reamed them. And so what you can see here is that before we touched them, so when they were just the same tap holes in both groups, for whatever reason, the 10 trees in that late season ream group were already outperforming the spring control trees by 1/10 of a gallon of syrup. So they started out ahead. And then if we look at the yields after we reamed them, the two trees, the trees with the deeper holes now, and the standard spring control trees yielded about the same amount. So for whatever reason, and that actually is hard to say, the sanitation in all of these was the same. There was really no difference, but for some reason, this group of trees was already outperforming the spring controls. So what looked like a gain that we got from late season reaming was actually an artifact of the fact that those trees started off ahead. So it's a really good lesson to us, a reminder to us and to all of us that there's a reason that we do these kinds of studies more than 1 year and in more than one place oftentimes, because just seeing something once, seeing a result once can sometimes be misleading. This is obviously, we're not seeing an effect of late season reaming. And so, yeah, it's just lesson learned. So we have no data from this study to suggest that late season reaming gave us any more sap at all. So this is a question that remains to be answered and isn't answered by this study. Okay, now we know a little bit more about yields, so we can look at least, or we did look at least one portion of the sustainability questions. So what about the non-conductive wood that we're adding here? So like I already mentioned, we already know that if we're making bigger tap holes in these longevity strategies, we're going to get more non-conductive wood because the size of non-conductive wood generated by each tap hole is generally proportional to the size of the hole. Bigger holes, more non-conductive wood. The question is how much more, and looking at the actual net benefit relative to that very important cost. So to examine this, we did a study to determine the volume of non-conductive wood generated by 2 of our freshening treatments relative to standard control tap holes. So we had 20 trees, and each one of those trees received 2 or 3 tap holes. They all received a control, a standard spring tap hole. So in this case, this was 5/16 inch and 1.5 inches deep. And then the trees also received at least 1 or 2 other tap holes. One was the fall ream deep treatment. So they got a 1/4 inch spout in the fall that was reamed to 5/16 inch and 2.5 inches deep in the spring. And then we also looked at that fall second hole treatment to see, okay, if we put a 5/16 inch, 1.5 inch deep hole in the fall, and then drill a same exact hole 2 inches higher than the first, do we really tap within that existing column of non-conductive wood for the first hole and ultimately make less non-conductive wood. So we wanted to actually look to see whether this happened. And I should mention that this portion of the study was also funded by an additional grant from the USDA NIFA Organic Transitions Program, which you'll see other results from shortly and this week as well in my other talk. Okay, so once we had those in, we then, of course, cut those trees down the subsequent fall. We removed a slab from each tree, or multiple slabs that contain the taphole. And then once that slab was removed, we then cut, beginning in the center of the taphole, cut 2-inch cookies above and below the taphole. And I apologize, this is a photo of Bert, obviously, but it's a nice photo of Mark doing exactly what we did in this study, and nicely shows how that's actually done. Once those cookies are cut, then we photograph each one with a scale that shows the actual scale of what we're doing. So it looks a little bit like this. And so we have a photograph of each cookie that from each tree, from each taphole, from each tree. And so some of the series of cookies look really awesome like this. So you can see this is the cut through the center of the taphole above the taphole, and this is the center of the taphole below. And then you can see the cookies go up in 2-inch increments and down in 2-inch increments. And this was a fabulous tree, so where the taphole stain is gone pretty much in 4 inches above the taphole. But realistically, most tapholes don't look like that. There's a lot of variation, but most of the tapholes that we see are going to do something more like this, where they're extending 14 inches, even more above and below the taphole. And these are just tapholes that have not intersected any pre-existing stains from other tapholes or other branch scars or the central column of discolored wood. Anyway, I'll discuss that a little bit more later. But once we have the cookies all photographed, we then use image analysis to measure the area of the stain in each cookie, and then we use the size of the cookie, 2 inches, to calculate the total volume in that cookie, and then we sum them up for the entire taphole stain so that we can get the total volume of non-conductive wood by each that is generated by each taphole. It is a lot of work. And so in this study, we have 2 tapholes, or 3, in each of our trees. So we have a control taphole, and then we have one of our treatment tapholes. So for all of these, we're calculating the percent of the non-conductive wood from our freshened taphole. How much is that relative to the volumes of our control tapholes? Again, and this really, because there's a lot of variation in how trees develop non-conductive wood, by doing the treatments in the same, looking at them and how they make non-conductive wood in the same tree, it really eliminates a lot of that variation, allows us to answer the question better. Okay, so what do we find? Well, first, as promised, this is where we find out why putting a second hole above the first one was really not a good idea. So this is the cut through the center of the taphole from one of those trees, the original hole. And when I first looked at this first set of cookies, I was like, oh, bummer. We accidentally tapped near an old taphole and didn't realize it. I'm going to have to throw this set of cookies out because it hit another area of non-conductive wood, so it's no good. But then when I looked at the cookie 2 inches above this one, I saw what was actually going on. And so if we look, this is the taphole, or sorry, the cookie that's 2 inches above the initial taphole. So we see what's going on. The stain we were seeing in the first cookie was actually the stain from that second taphole that we put in 2 inches above the first. And so this was interesting. I thought, oh, if you don't get the second taphole exactly in line in the same, at the same angle as the first one, then it's not going to, it's going to make, it's not going to be perfectly in line. So, so we have to make it perfectly in line. Unfortunately, or fortunately, well, I guess it's not unfortunate or fortunate, but what we came to find out is that it didn't matter whether we got them exactly in line or whether they were a little bit off in the angle. Regardless, each of those tapholes made a completely separate taphole stain of the same size as a standard taphole. Whether they were directly in line with one another, a little off angle, or what, it did not matter. And I, of course, have lots of pictures of this because I thought it was really neat. But basically, while the idea of this treatment was to reduce the amount of non-conductive wood we were generating by tapping within that same column of non-conductive wood, it turned out that we can't fool trees. They are going to do what they do, and you can't get something for nothing. That second taphole generates a completely separate area of non-conductive wood, just like an independent taphole that we would put anywhere else in the tree. So by generating two complete non-conductive wood columns, this definitely failed in terms of the idea of what it was supposed to do. So definitely not a good idea. So here are the total volumes of the non-conductive wood columns for each of those treatments, our control, the ones that were reamed wider and deeper, and then that second hole 2 inches above. But again, it's really most important how these relate to the volume generated by the control tapholes in the same tree. And so if we look at it that way, setting those at 100%, so sort of just what we saw visually, that second taphole 2 inches above, the total volume of stain in those trees was just over twice the amount of the control tapholes. So it literally made double the amount of non-conductive wood. So 2 holes, 2 columns of non-conductive wood. And then when we look at our reamed wider and deeper tapholes, these generated 275% more stain than the control tapholes in the same tree. So another way of saying that is by reaming them from 1/4 inch to 5/16 inch and 1 inch deeper, we generated just under 3 times more non-conductive wood. And so on one hand, that's not super surprising. We're making a deeper and bigger hole, or actually we're making a hole that's ultimately just 1 inch deeper. It's the same size diameter in the end as our control taphole. So we're making a bigger hole. So we expect it to generate a little bit more non-conductive wood, but 3 times more is a lot. And the way that we can actually kind of tease this out is by looking at how much stain was generated in proportion to the size of the hole. And so this shows it set up in that way. So the purple bars here show the total volume of the finished hole in those treatments. So the control tapholes had 0.11 cubic inches of volume of hole, and those reamed wider and deeper tapholes, the finished taphole, that volume was at 19.19 cubic inches. So, and then if we look at the total volume of non-conductive wood generated, we have 4.3 cubic inches in our control tapholes and 11.6 cubic inches in our reamed wider and deeper tapholes. So this represents about 40 times the volume of the hole, while this represents over 60 times the volume of the hole. So these reamed or freshened tapholes actually generated proportionally more non-conductive wood. So this is some indication that by perturbing that taphole more than once, it actually generates more non-conductive wood than would have been generated by a hole by one hole that same size. So not just more non-conductive wood that we would expect from the bigger hole, but more than we would have expected from a hole of that same size that we just did initially. So definitely a significant effect. So kind of to tie all this together, if we look back at what we saw for just yields, so looking at the yields from just the fall and early winter tapholes where we didn't generate any extra non-conductive wood, we just drilled those holes and let them go. So By tapping in the fall, getting around 80% of the yields of our standard spring tapholes, that is probably not an attractive gain in yield, especially when you are considering some of the not so easy things about making syrup in the fall. So tapping in the fall is probably not optimal to do unless there are other compelling reasons to do it. And I put this in here as a possibility that if you're in an area or an operation where you really typically get a lot of your yield after late season flavor buddy has developed, then potentially tapping in the fall might be more attractive if you can get a higher proportion of your total crop in a time period where you're not having buddy off flavor. But that is a bigger, we can talk about that in the question period if we want to. It's kind of a bigger issue. Early winter tapping, by giving us 92% yield of the spring tapholes, you know, there's no compelling reason to go tap in December or January just to get extra yield. That's not going to do it. But this is not extremely discouraging if you know you have to tap in that early time period in order to just get things in. So then if we look at the yields from our freshened treatments, our longevity treatments, so clearly with our fall reamed tapholes, reamed and deeper tapholes at 100, you know, the same yields as our spring control, there's really no compelling reason to do that. And especially when you consider the extra costs of visiting it twice, using 2 spouts, etc. So then the other treatments, so the fall tapholes that were drilled deeper, and then the 2 winter and then freshened tapholes, we do see a little bit of a gain in yield. However, we also just saw that we had significantly more non-conductive wood, not just the amount that we would expect from a slightly larger hole, but more than that. So we add that particular cost in, plus the additional labor for 2 rounds of tapping, our extra spouts, and plenty of extra bits. We broke a lot of bits doing this. And all of a sudden, the net benefits of this is, you know, that gain in yield is really not looking that attractive. And so to just put some economic numbers on this, well, first and foremost, when we have deeper tapholes in general, we have a greater chance of hitting existing non-conductive wood like we've done here. When that does, so anytime you're drilling a deeper taphole, your chances are going to increase of that. So anytime a taphole intercepts a portion of already existing non-conductive wood, the total amount of non-conductive wood generated by that taphole explodes. And I think I have pictures of that later on. So you're already, by drilling deeper tapholes with some of these longevity treatments, enhancing the chances of generating non-conductive, more non-conductive wood. And we also just saw in the results of our study of this that by drilling the taphole, perturbing it twice, that we got even more non-conductive wood than we would expect to. So we have the potential for lots of additional non-conductive wood from these longevity treatments. And this comes back to our dollars and cents in a very meaningful way. So what are the consequences of adding this additional non-conductive wood? Well, we know that that basically means that there's a greater chance of hitting non-conductive wood when we're tapping. So the proportion of the tapping zone of our trees that are non-conductive wood is basically equivalent to the chances of hitting non-conductive wood when we're tapping. So the greater the proportion of non-conductive wood in the tapping zone, the greater the chances are we have of intercepting it and drilling into it when we're tapping. So if 20% of the tapping zone is non-conductive wood, we have a 20% chance. If 60% of the tapping zone is non-conductive wood, we have a 60% chance. And this is important and relates to the overall net benefit of what we're doing, because of course we know that drilling into non-conductive wood means that we're going to get significantly less sap from that taphole. So as we accumulate more non-conductive wood as a result or consequence of doing one of these longevity strategies, it increases the chance that we're going to have significantly reduced yields in the long term from those particular trees. So when we're talking about significantly less sap, it can be up to 75% less sap from when we drill into non-conductive wood. So the economic consequences of adding this additional non-conductive wood become very substantial over time. And so if we're doing one of these treatments, if by increasing the amount of non-conductive wood we're adding to get this relatively small amount of increase in yield, it can ultimately come back to shoot us in the foot in the future by increasing the amount of non-conductive wood that we're adding to these trees pretty substantially. We have much higher chances of hitting it when we're tapping and ultimately obtaining reduced yields in the future. So from a more long-term standpoint, that 15 or 20% potential increase in yield, ultimately it gets erased to zero if we factor in the effects of adding that additional amount of non-conductive wood, let alone any other potential impacts that we're having on overall tree health, which are likely to be definitely an issue since we are adding additional wounding and taking additional or keeping that wound open longer. So to bring it back, as I kind of said I would, to those original yields from those treatments. So remember that those yields, even from our fall control trees, which were much lower than the spring control trees, all of the yields in the study were extremely good. And part of the reason for that is not only is it a super tight system with extremely good levels, at high levels of vacuum, extremely tight, no leaks, there are also no losses. You know, we're calculating the yields based on what actually comes out of the tree. So this shows us that there are lots of other areas where we can improve the yields from what we're getting that don't require us to put 2 tapholes in a tree and extend our season. So any strategies that we have to maximize the level of vacuum in our trees, so things like, you know, managing leaks and designing our tubing system, so anything like that is going to be huge in terms of our increases in yields or getting closer to optimized yields, but also losses down the line, such as how we manage our RO and our filter press, flavor, density, and this is also, you know, not to mention different tapping practices and things related to the health and size and growth of our trees. So there are lots of other ways, if we're looking to get that increase in yield, this sort of modest increase in yield that we saw from some of these treatments, lots of different, let's say, lower hanging fruit, easier ways to obtain that than by going through these strategies, which not only require us to do a lot of extra labor, but also, as we can see, potentially harm our yields in the long term and potentially harm our trees in the long term. So these issues, these other strategies to maximize yield, are the subject of my presentation on Thursday. So I invite you all to come as sort of part 2 of this presentation. So if you want to increase your yield, don't do this. But come on Thursday and we'll talk about how other ways that are less disastrous to improve your yields. So skip over that and just say thank you. And hopefully, I know this, I have no idea what time it is. Looks like we have 2 minutes for questions or more. I'm happy to stay as long as anyone wants to answer questions. So thank you for hanging in this long. I really appreciate it.
That's terrific, Abby. Thank you very much for such a good presentation. As we mentioned at the beginning, we have some time. Hopefully, folks can share their questions. We do have one in the chat right off the bat, and if other people want to ask a question, not by typing it in, by asking it themselves, please raise your hand, and we will call on you. So right off the bat, Abby, we have a question from Matt Fisher. He asks, you show non-conductive wood resulting from control and drilling bigger and deeper, but what about the quantity of non-conductive wood resulting from only drilling deeper? Also, in the winter scenarios that resulted in additional volume, did the additional yield occur in a single sap run or over several runs?
Well, so the first question, so for the study, let's see if we can get back here, or maybe it's not that important to do that. But for the study of non-conductive wood, you're right, the freshening treatment that we looked at drilled the, sorry, it's way further back than I thought it was. The treatment that we looked at was one where we re-drilled it wider and subsequently deeper. So we didn't look at one where we only drilled deeper, but it's certainly something that we like to look at, but we can fairly safely extrapolate that because this one went deeper, went to that depth as well, that results are likely to be fairly similar. But yeah, you're right, that would be good to look at separately, and we do hope to look at a little bit more of these questions related to non-conductive wood development separately. But as you can imagine, being as destructive as they are, this type of study has to be very, very well planned. And so, but we do hope to get some more data on that. And as far as the question about whether in the winter scenarios where we're getting additional volume, the volume that we got from all of those treatments are basically the sum total of all of the different runs. So while because we're only collecting the sap and measuring the sap every so often, we're allowing several runs to collect, we don't have great data on exactly how much was coming in individual sap runs. So whether there were giant sap runs after they got re-drilled that really made up all the difference. So we can only say that there was a greater total volume over the total season that sap flow was measured. We can see a little bit by looking, or get a little bit of information, looking at the percent of yield that we got during the separate periods. So we can see that not a whole lot of the additional sap that we got from the winter treatments happened in the winter, and the same with fall, really, but especially with the winter. So Matt, I hope that kind of answered your questions in some semi-satisfactory manner.
All right, we have a question from Craig Line. He asks, what data do you have on 5/16 spouts versus 1/4-inch spouts?
Well, Craig, that's a lovely question and a nice softball setup for my talk on Thursday. But since you guys all hung in, I will give you a preview. We know that spout diameter affects yield. And I assume that's what the question is about. So the yields from a 1/4-inch spout relative to a 5/16 spout are going to be approximately 10% less. So, and that is with the same level of vacuum, everything equally tight. All things being equal, your 1/4-inch spouts are going to lose you around 10% of your yield. So I hope, and Craig, if that wasn't then what you meant about your question, feel free to put in the chat.
Definitely don't hesitate to show up for Abby's presentation on Thursday too. So I'm sure there's a lot more to it. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. Are there any people who want to speak up and ask a question themselves?
Yeah, if you want to either speak up, unmute yourself, or put your hand up if you want to, but you should be free to unmute yourselves if you want to just speak up. All
right. Actually, two things. Craig responded saying yes, that was it. Thank you.
Great.
And then a question from Salvatore asking, I have a question about tap depth in relation to age or diameter of the tree. Should I drill 1.5 inch tap hole on younger, smaller trees as opposed to deeper to 2.5 inches on larger, older trees?
That's a great, super question, and it actually doesn't have a super simple answer in some way. So, just looking at it in a simple way, with a smaller tree size, you have less conductive wood in the tapping zone there to work with. So, very broadly speaking, a shallower taphole depth may be more appropriate in a tree like that. But as we will talk about on Thursday, and I hope you come, there are a lot of different other factors that go into what is the optimum tapping depth and diameter for my trees. So things like the growth rate of that tree is going to influence whether that 1.5 inch deep taphole is really necessary on that smaller, younger tree, or whether, you know, it may have superb growth rates and it might be possible to do a 2-inch taphole in that tree. So things like growth rate, how much non-conductive wood is already there from previous tapping, those will all influence it. But on the sort of basic, like very, very big, broad brush strokes, sure, the smaller the tree, the more likely you are going to want to have, that it would be more appropriate to have a shallower taphole in those trees.
Great, and a couple of cheers from folks. And Salvatore says thank you. Didn't want to damage the tree for future use. So.
Yeah, it's huge, and I do like. We will talk about this quite a bit on Thursday. So definitely would love to expand on that. So if you guys can come on Thursday, that would be super. And obviously, you know, if there are questions that come up afterwards that you don't want to speak up and say no, you guys all know where to find me, I'm pretty sure. So feel free to reach out and ask them later.
Any more questions?
I'm very, I am surprised at the quietness of the group. People are maybe a little bit shy.
Thank you, Abby.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here, everyone, and hanging in. It's a long one.
Yeah, I missed half the audio. I had to load Google on my browser, but thanks. I look forward to Thursday.
Super. I'm glad you got at least half of it. Sorry about that.
All right, it sounds like there aren't any more questions. We can last call for questions. All right,
Abby, real quick, Mark, if you don't mind. Abby, what about further south? What about the different regions and like how the weather is affected different? I'm from central Pennsylvania. We have vastly different weather than you do.
Yes, that I'm so glad that you brought that up. I do think that there could be climates in which some of this may be more effective to do. But there's kind of two other, how am I going to say, two other things to keep in mind. Your climate is not going to get you away or allow you to escape from the impacts of that additional non-conductive wood. So from that standpoint alone, like, I can't recommend one of these practices anywhere. But as far as just early tapping, so tapping in the fall or early winter, then, you know, in an area like central Pennsylvania or Ohio or West Virginia, like, this is really more of your potential primary tapping season. So certainly it is something that I would be thinking of if I was in a warmer climate with potentially earlier thaws. Tapping in the early fall or tapping in the fall or early winter is something way more important to consider without subsequent freshening. Like, for me at this point, based on what we are seeing so far, I simply cannot recommend perturbing a taphole a second time. Unless I see other data that don't agree with this. And certainly we will look at this more. We hope to look at this more. But right now, just based on the impacts on the tree, I can't recommend any kind of redrilling or freshening strategy. But early tapping, much more important to think about. It's not even, I guess, for many of your areas, it's not even an early treatment. It's just going to be the prime season is earlier than it is here, which makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
We actually had another one come in, Abby. From Miriam.
I can see this, or do you want to read it out loud? It's a long one.
It's up to you. I'm happy to read it, or if you want to read it and then respond.
All right. So a question from Miriam. you said in your first slide that early warm temperatures that cause season to end earlier. I was listening to the 2020 maple season podcast from UVM, and I believe Mark Islehart said that 2020 was a good year for maple syrup production because March was warmer than the past 2 years, but it didn't get too warm in April. Can you get more specific with regard to temperatures? What is warm and when might it be a good thing for sap flow, and what is not too cold can cause the season to end early? So that's a lot, and those are really good questions. So the warm, I think there have been various thoughts and some study done in terms of what warm means, in terms of what causes tapholes to dry. Work that Steve Childs has done at Cornell, he's really over the years seen that it is he looks at degrees above, days when it's above 50 degrees. And he's found over the years that after about 4 days of 50-degree temperatures, that is what really starts to promote the microbial growth that causes taphole drying to begin and to really get sped up. So that's one part of too warm. There's other types of too warm, like we saw in saw in 2012, where we had just 70-degree temperatures, and it just took we might have only been able to take 2 days of that before things really tanked. And that wasn't just with respect to starting tapholes to dry up. That was actually initiating enough of the metabolism, a sort of exit of dormancy in the trees, to bring about changes in sap chemistry to cause buddy off flavor. So some of the warm temperatures have to do with sap flow and microbial growth, and some of it have to do with the physiology of the tree and making flavor that is making off flavors. And I'm gonna stop yapping and ask Mark if he has, since that was your podcast, do you have anything you want to add about that?
No, I think you nailed it. I mean, I think the 2018 and 2019 seasons were really pretty cold at the start. And so what we saw in 2020 was it was warm enough for some sap flow, at least, again, I'm talking in that podcast about Vermont, but it holds true in other places. So there was enough to capture some sap, but it wasn't so hot that we saw like in 2012, where there's that really past a threshold where the tapholes really started to become contaminated significantly. So no, I think that's great. All right, we're 12 past. Any other questions? Or as Abby said, I'm sure she'd be happy to respond to questions on email if you have some. I will take this one opportunity to say thanks again, Abby, for all the tremendous depth and density to this conversation we had. It's really terrific. There's so many different factors to think about. And I'll just put in one more pitch for people to check out the rest of the Maple Conference week. You can still register for classes up to 24 hours before they start. And we have lots of other topics beyond production. We have marketing, we have sugar bush health issues. So please feel free to join us. Coming up next at noon, we have a review of Vermont maple regulations and inspections of retail syrup from Tucker Diego from the Agency of Agriculture. So that's some pretty interesting stuff on the syrup quality. And then this evening, thinning in the sugar bush with Peter Smallage from Cornell University, which will be a really interesting topic. So thanks everyone, have a great day if we don't see you later today, and please think about joining us. And if you are looking for Forrester credit, please email me directly and I'll get you a certificate. Thanks again. I hope everyone has a great day and stay safe.
Thanks everyone for coming. Have a good day.